So good afternoon, everyone. I hope you had a nice break. So we're now starting, we're entering in the afternoon with a series of presentations that are the moments in this 5-day course has moments of opening and closing. There are some sessions that are internal for the whole group, and there are some other moments where we want to share these conversations, these interests, and the problems that are gathering us here with the city, with publics, and also with those who are interested in listening to us online, since the public sessions are going to be live streamed. And evolving in this muscular way between us together and us more, we're going to have this rhythm throughout the different days, and this will be our first public session. And thank you again, Michael, for accepting our invitation. As mentioned, Michael's writing concerning the wider environmental humanities, and in particular, the ways in which the natural thoughts have shaped, and also have been shaped, by different traditions of philosophical and theoretical input, have been fundamental for thinking the relationship between the concreteness of the problems concerning lithium and wider concerns in terms of our human relationship to energy, to sources that give input, that allow machines, bodies, human and non-human bodies, to be active, to produce more, to create more, to consume more. And it's exactly due to Michael's thoughts on energy and its connection, and his own redefinition or rethinking the origins of the concept of energy and its connection to the wider thinking of the world in its natural terms, that we invited him. And I'll pass the word to him. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Filipa. It's a pleasure to be with all of you here. Since we are in Portugal, I'll just say a few words of thanks in Portuguese. Muito obrigado pelo convite. É prazer de estar aqui convosco. Agradeço principalmente a Filipa, como já disse, também a toda a equipa, o Nuno, a Ana, que fizeram esta visita muito agradável também. So the topic that we're about to touch upon cannot be easily circumscribed within a 10-minute talk, a 40-minute talk, or even an hours-long conversation, as we all know. And even this course, as Marina said, is just the beginning of an ongoing engagement. But in the background of what I'm going to say today is a kind of specifically philosophical concern, which is not at all purely theoretical. So it's often thought that philosophy deals with subject matters that are somehow removed from this world here below. But in this case, as in many others, philosophy actually has a lot to tell us about contemporary problems and practices, and in this case, of what is going wrong with humanity's relation to energy. So when I started working on this topic, it occurred to me that while everyone was concerned about the sources of energy and the different destructive, extractive ways of procuring it, the question of what is energy was not on anyone's mind. This, at the same time, very obvious question, but also a very obscure one. Because if I ask you what is energy, and when I asked myself what was energy, I had a lot of problems answering this question. And this disquietude, this unease was at the origins of the book that Marina mentioned, Energy Dreams of Actuality. And by the way, speaking about the title of that book, Energy Dreams, is meant to be read both in the substantive and in the verbal senses. So dreams is not only a noun, the energy dreams that we have, but energy itself that dreams up this world or this nightmare of a world, including ourselves, right? This is another possibility, a strange, uncanny possibility that arises here. So, and of course, the other important point is that energy is a gift of philosophy to the world, because the word itself did not exist until Aristotle invented it. This word that derives from Greek is not a word that was used in everyday language. Aristotle was the one who actually invented this term and insisted that it should never be interpreted the way that we grasp energy today. So curiously enough, Aristotle gives us various definitions of energy, but one of his circuitous definitions of it is precisely the opposite of what we associate energy with today. That's on the one hand. On the other hand, it is a gift from philosophy to the world that is yet to be received. One that, regardless of our constant hankering after energy, and hankering that is compulsive, that gives rise precisely to these compulsive desires, is thoroughly forgotten, and that from the depths of this oblivion will continue steering the world so long as something still endures, holding tight to being, right? So it's at the same time the object of everyone's desire and a very obscure object that no one can really pinpoint and identify. Along with these preparatory thoughts, a set of questions comes to light. How to delimit the unlimited? How to conjugate philosophy and energy, keeping in mind the origination of the latter, of energy, from the former, from philosophy, at least as a concept, and the subsequent betrayal of that origin. What is the paradigm that could do justice to this conjunction? And just for the sake of schematizing and delimiting the unlimited in this way, the framework that I propose for our conversation today is derived from physics. So very briefly, I will invite you to think about the concept of energy along the model of the framework of electricity, where we have the positive and the negative charges and the electrical current that runs between one and the other. We will first consider the positive charge of energeia in Aristotle, who identified it with the actuality of the actual. So when pressed for the meaning of energy, Aristotle tells us that energy is simply everything that is just as it is, right? And we will see also a more negative definition of it, right? Then we will pay attention to the negative charge that resignifies the term precisely at the rise of industrial capitalism, at the very origins of industrial capitalism in the early 19th century, bestowing on it the exact opposite sense of potentiality, right? So while energy as energia arises as actuality, as everything that is, in modernity, in capitalist modernity in particular, it is understood as potentiality, precisely what actuality is not. Rather than a radical correction of Aristotle, this polarizing modern signification unfolds within the field prepared in, if also rejected by, Greek antiquity, and unblocks the electrical current of the concept of energy, the directional flow of charged particles of meaning from the positive to the negative pole. Because, as I mentioned, this negative definition of energy as potentiality has been already prepared by Aristotle, even though he vehemently insisted on the fact that energy should not be defined in this way, should not be thought of as dynamis, as potentiality, which is what it has become for us. And of course, potentiality is what there is never enough of, because it never reaches its fulfillment, its conclusion in the actual, in the concreteness of what is. Still, the flow of these charged particles does not happen just by itself. The equivalent of electromotive force, or EMF, is a fresh glance at the history of philosophy, not as a field dotted with static monuments to past achievements of thought, but as an electric or electromagnetic semantic field. So when I'm referring to Aristotle, I'm not unearthing some old, dusty theory, but rather I'm trying to see the whole field of philosophy as alive and as bristling with the electric meaning of concepts, including the concept of energy. Aristotle is as alive, or maybe even more alive today, as he was more than 2,000 years ago. Only by grasping the conceptual circuitry of energy as a whole will we be in a position to appreciate the complex relation of this concept to philosophy and to our actuality. So just a little bit of background from physics, which is not crucial, but will give you a little bit more of a sense of what is going on here. Field theory in physics explains the interactions of one charge with another charge at a different place and at a later time. What of the conceptual space and time that constitute the history of philosophy? And how does the field of a charged concept, in this case, the concept of energy, interact with another such charged unit, which is also energy in its otherness to itself? The electric field of a positive charge irradiates outwards in all directions. This is what Aristotle's thinking does. That is, mutatis mutandis, the influence of Aristotelian energeia on the future thinking of energy, including our thinking or non-thinking of it today. Nowhere near a self-contained unit, energeia creates its own field to which, undeterred by various efforts poured into forgetting the conceptual origin of energy, thinking must respond. Instead of considering the electric force as a direct interaction of two electric charges at a distance from each other, one charge is considered in physics as the source of an electric field that extends outward into the surrounding space. And the force exerted on the second charge in this space is considered as a direct interaction between the electric field and the second charge. So this is what I want to do with Aristotle and his thinking of energeia. It follows then that delving into Aristotle's energeia, we are gaining much more than insight into a particular form of conceptualizing energy. We are entering a field with which every ensuing form of this conceptualization will have to contend and interact in one way or another. And so what follows consists of 4 different parts, relatively short, because I want us to have enough time and space for discussion. First, we will talk about the positive charge of energy in Aristotle. Energeia is actuality. Then we will consider the negative charge of energy, its resignification in modernity as power and potentiality, so the exact opposite of the actual. Then we will see how the electrical current of energy as a concept passes between these two charges into the 20th and 21st centuries. And finally, we will see the kind of promise that philosophical thinking and rethinking of energy holds for alternative practices connected to this concept. So first, the positive charge of energy. Energeia, as already mentioned, is an Aristotelian coinage, a neologism made of the prefix en, the root ergon, and the suffix eia. So Aristotle just made this term artificially by putting these different semantic components together. In my energy dreams, I propose translating this word from which energy derives as enworkment. So enworkment, this is the literal sense of energeia. While noting that the work in its midst is nowhere near transparent. We have to work at it, at this work, if we are to appreciate its countless nuances. The range of what ergon, work, at the heart of energeia signifies is quite broad, from task to function and from work to its product, right? So combining an accomplished work and the workings that precede and succeeded, energeia encompasses the potential thing in the making and the actual thing that is made. So energeia already combines the work as an activity and the work as a product of that activity, the potential thing in the making and the actual thing that is made. It thus pulls together two opposite strands of sense that will have been elucidated in the course of history, and that will have received their differential evaluations already from Aristotle himself. Now, the word invented by Aristotle expresses nevertheless a hidden preference before any philosophical justification or theoretical explanation. Energeia is a noun with the suffix eia. It is a substantive term. The English activation maybe also is fitting alongside enworkment, and it includes an act, an active force, but also a quelling of the act in the substantive form of ation, the suffix that we see in the Greek energeia, eia, as well. Energeia, Aristotle states in Metaphysics, and I quote him, means the presence of the thing not in the sense which we mean by potentiality, unquote. So energeia is the presence of the thing not in the sense in which we mean potential, right? It is then a mode of presence of the thing that is not merely potential, is not suffused with dynamis, and is already not or not yet present condition. The positive conceptual charge of energy consists in a double negative, not dynamis, not lack, which potentiality embodies vis-a-vis actuality. You see, so at the origins, at the source of energeia, there is a kind of fullness of being, not a lack. And we can only have these compulsive desires if we start with a lack, if energy signifies a constant lack for us, right? But what if, at the origins of this term, it actually signifies the exact opposite, fullness, right? And that is the analog of the electrical field that the term creates. Although reflections on the pair energeia dynamis, or actuality potentiality, begin with a consideration of movement, kinesis, they are not limited to movement alone, reaching all the way down or all the way up to the ontological level. So movement for Aristotle is irreducible to changes of place. It is not a constant to and fro that we associate with movement. It involves also what in modernity would be called development or unfolding. For Aristotle, movement is also development or unfolding, with the moments of growth, metamorphosis, and decay included. All of those are movements as well. All of those are components of energy, of energeia. Growth, metamorphosis, and decay. Should we confine our thinking to movement, it would appear as if potentiality with its dynamism were primary, as if everything were ceaselessly guided from potentialities to actualities. As in Aristotle's words, everything changes from what it is potentially to what it is actually. And the change is metabole, right? This metabolism of being, right? Which is a variety of movement, once again, in Aristotle. Were we conversely to insist on the immobility of being compared to becoming, we would endorse nothing more than a privation of movement. So immobility is but a privation of movement, which is not the same kind of double negative as that implied in the definition of energeia as not dynamis. By working his way through movement, Aristotle arrives at an insight into the unmoved mover, right? This concept that he's famous for and he's been blamed for throughout the deconstruction of Western metaphysics, his attempt to reach pure energy or actuality unalloyed with potentiality. So the unmoved mover is what Aristotle means by energeia. This is what energy is. It's the unmoved mover. And so it seems, Aristotle suggests, still in metaphysics, that everything that actually functions has a potentiality, whereas not everything that has a potentiality actually functions, so that potentiality is prior. These are only potential actualities, not living up to his roundabout definition of energeia in terms of the presence of the thing rid of potentiality. And so still within the phenomenal field of movement, Aristotle leaps to that which moves without being moved, a conceptual knot tying together energeia, or actuality, being, and the unmoved mover. With regard to a work, ergon, we must conclude that while it comes out of itself, there is, in Aristotle's words, also something that moves it. And since that which is moved while it moves is intermediate, there is something which moves without being moved, something eternal, which is both substance and actuality. And this is energy for him, right? So a lot of metaphysical luggage is put into energy here. And of course, the words that he uses, substance and actuality, ousia kai energeia, right? Even a cursory glance is sufficient to realize that the unmoved mover has little to do with the metaphysical caricatures it has been subject to in the history of philosophy. Pure, active, without a shadow of passivity, eternal being, deduced from the impossibility of infinite regress, is entwined with the movement of becoming. So the movement of becoming is not precluded by energeia. It is already enfolded into it. Corresponding to the definition of energeia as a presence that is not potential, it does not stagnate, but moves without being moved. So energeia with its fullness of being for Aristotle is not stagnation, is not presence as a kind of static being, but movement without being moved. Its activity is counterbalanced by a substantive form, first as ousia, substance or being, second as energeia. In the shape of actuality, Aristotle's energy, energeia, is at the same time the act that actuality contains, the unity of subject and substance, to put it in Hegelian language, right? So this is a kind of very strange, from our modern perspective, view of energy as the actual, as everything that is just as it is, right? And then we move to the negative charge of energy, power and potentiality, which is what we unconsciously and implicitly associate energy with in our modernity and late modernity as well. The Aristotelian line of thinking energy as actuality survived in philosophy up to the 19th century, when Hegel translated energeia as Wirklichkeit in his own dialectical system. This line, I'll merely outline it very briefly. It passes through Plotinus, who is adamant that pure actuality is accessible in the intelligible world, whereas potential existence is the world of things perceived by the senses. It then makes a detour through theology. So Aristotle's thinking of energy as actuality survived in theology. In Western Christianity, St. Thomas Aquinas' definition of matter as potential and the energy of actus purus as the being of God in Summa Theologiae. And in the Eastern Byzantine tradition, we may highlight the contrast that Gregory Palamas draws between divine creative power and divine energies directed toward created things, right? Then in the German context, Meister Eckhart forms a link of sorts between Aristotle and Hegel by projecting the difference between the divine act and God's supreme inactivity, the difference we also find in Palamas, onto the distinction between God, Gott, and Godhead, Gottheit. So this line extending from Aristotle to Hegel, where energy is actuality, amplifies the conceptual E-field of positively charged energeia. Nonetheless, in the 19th century, as I already mentioned, precisely when industrial capitalism is taking off on a grand scale, the thinking of energy undergoes a dramatic reversal as it becomes synonymous with potency, potentiality, or power. Energy acquires the very meaning that Aristotle denied it, namely that associated with dynamis, or the Latin potestas. At roughly the same time, energy leaves the purview of philosophy and is said to be the competence of physicists and other scientists. So in the 19th century, philosophers no longer have much to say about energy and becomes an issue of physicists. Which begs the question, can one think energy philosophically only with and through Aristotle as the movement of and in the actual? The laws of thermodynamics are fundamental in physics, And in one way or another, they deal with energy under the heading of dynamis, thermodynamics, dynamis, right? Potentiality. For example, the first law of thermodynamics, also known as the law of the conservation of energy, was codified by German chemist Carl Friedrich Mohr in 1837, presenting energy as the one and only agent in the physical world. And these are the words of Mohr. Right? Mohr's word for energy is Kraft, force or power. Work, the ergon of energia, is no more than the process of transferring energy from one system to another. That is the active dynamism of energetic transformations. Their passive dynamism, in turn, is encapsulated in potential energy, a term coined by Scottish physicist William Rankine, and referring to energy stored in any physical system, right? So the active sense of dynamic energy is its passage from one closed system to another, and the passive sense of dynamism is the storage of energy. And precisely, I want to highlight this because storage is the key problem that we're dealing with practically, right? Because lithium and batteries are answers to this problem of storing energy, not so much procuring it as really accumulating it in one place. As I note in Energy Dreams, apropos of this concept, stored energy retains the potential for conversion into other types of energy, participating in an endless chain of events that will never be actualized. So the storage is always a means for something else, and energy becomes a pure means without an end because it is stored for any reason you can think of, to power this or that industry, device, gadget, and so on. But it has no inherent end in itself. Energy becomes a pure means, and in that sense, it departs from the constellation of meanings that Aristotle gives it as an actuality, which is already included with a certain understanding of ends, of the question why. Why do we need it? Why do we store it? Why do we use it? What for, right? After energy is conceived as a quantum of power or force, it can only present itself as active or passive dynamism. That is to say, an actively changing or passively stored potentiality, saddled with a minus sign in Aristotle's philosophy. The second law of thermodynamics, crystallized in the works of 19th century French engineer Nicolas Léonard Carnot and refined by German physicist Rudolf Clausius, introduces the notion of entropy. And this is what, consciously or not, we're all afraid of at the level of societies, at the level of individuals, losing energy, energy escaping from us, oozing away, the entropy of our societies, our own individual bodies, of the universe itself, right? Besides the fact that the sequence of energy transformations can never be actualized, that is, all we have are transitions from one potential energy to another, every energy system, and these are the words of Clausius, that goes through a cycle of operations and returns to its original state does so only by increasing the entropy of its exterior with which it is interacting, unquote. Putting energy to work is losing it, right? So, and this is the kind of strange treadmill. Besides the compulsive desires, the more energy is deployed, the more of it is lost even in the future, not only in the present, right? Putting energy to work is losing it irreversibly, despite all illusions of renewability, leading to its entropic dispersal from the system at work. Curiously, Clausius invented the word entropy on the Aristotelian model, replacing ergon with trope, right? So it's a German scientist, engineer, who invents this word by resorting again to Greek and taking the word trope, transformation or change, and adding a prefix to it, entropy. In fact, entropy means precisely dynamis, that rather than the opposite of energy comes to define its operativity, the condition of being at work. It ties energy to movement, indeed to a specific variety of movement in Aristotle that is metabolism, implying the primacy of potentiality, even as kinetic energy converts kinesis, in the limited sense of movement as dislocation, into one among many types of energy: chemical, thermal, gravitational, nuclear, etc. Energy at rest, for its part, is equally in the grip of potentiality insofar as it implies, according to Rankine, storage in a closed system prior to its release or transformation. Hence, batteries and so on, as miniature models of that. The conceptual tyranny of dynamis becomes total by the time the second law of thermodynamics is formulated. The conceptual tyranny of dynamis in the understanding of energy. In 19th and 20th century philosophy, a shift in the concept of energy takes place in an encrypted fashion, in a kind of hidden fashion, given the relegation of this concept no longer as a concept but as a scientific term to physics and associated disciplines. From Friedrich Nietzsche's will to power, through Martin Heidegger's assertion in Being and Time that higher than actuality stands possibility, dynamis in thin disguise gains an upper hand over energeia in philosophy as well. So if you look at the trends in 20th and even 21st century philosophy, you see a parallel movement toward the primacy of the possible, of the potential over the actual, a kind of rebellion against Aristotle once again, and against the original sense of energeia. Heidegger's programmatic statement, namely that higher than actuality stands possibility, is vital to the entire existentialist tradition of the 20th century, where the actual is actually subjugated to the possible. So to understand the meaning of human being as a being, we have to understand human possibilities, not an actual being of a person, right? And that is not to mention other currents of thought, such as possible worlds theory or fictionalism, that present a hyperbolic version of the same tacit resignification of whatever remains of energy in philosophy. So how can we create a dialogue between this ancient way of thinking energy as actuality and the modern, all too modern way of understanding it as potentiality? This is the next topic of unblocking the electrical current of energy as a concept. So I'm not saying that we should simply salvage the old ancient notion of energy as actuality, but we should create a kind of flow of semantically charged particles from one idea of energy to the other. How to do that? From the standpoint of Aristotelian philosophy, the attribution of potentiality and power to energy makes it into what it is not. So Aristotle, more than 2,000 years ago, told us you should not understand energy as dynamis, as potentiality, which is what 19th century physics went ahead and did precisely. We lose energy the moment we think we have captured it in the nets of dynamis, now translated into the Latin potestas or potentia. However radical and however impervious to historical antecedents, this inversion happens on the grounds of Aristotelianism. We live in a topsy-turvy, upside-down world of energeia identified with its other, right? So we hear from Marx that the world of capital is an upside-down world. The world of metaphysics is also an upside-down world where material reality here below is devalued and sacrificed on the altar of eternal being itself. The same happens with energy. We live in a world of an upside-down energeia identified with its other, which is also, not by coincidence, the upside-down reality of capital, where exchange value is primary with respect to use value, right? And when we're talking about extractivism, we have to understand it not only in the physical sense of breaking through the crusts of the earth to extract certain valuable materials from it, but also in the sense of precisely this understanding of energy as potentiality. Because when lithium is extracted from the mines, when coal or petroleum are extracted, it is not only or not so much lithium or coal or petroleum, it is the potentiality that they embody, right? So the ultimate end goal, which is endless, is potentiality, right? This is what extractivism aims at. It breaks through the crusts, the layers of the actual, and discards them as pure garbage, right? In order to extract, to get at what is considered to be truly valuable, which is the potential, the possible. The inversion is not an instance of betraying an authentic concept what we ought to recover at any cost. Instead, it is an opportunity to air the traditional notion of energy, stamped by Aristotle, and to examine its actual historical interaction with potentiality. One of the last thinkers to hear an echo of Aristotle's Energeia, Hegel laid the foundations for thinking this interaction dialectically. In dialectics, whereby through a self-negation, energy generates its opposite, right? So a Hegelian reading of Aristotle would be this negation of energy, which has come to identify the meaning of energy for us today, is integral, inherent to this concept. So we are living through a self-negation of energy. Our actuality, our world today, is dreamt up by the self-negation of energy as a subject of this world, right? And also as dialectics, interpreted as the trials and tribulations of Energie, Wirklichkeit, energy, right? As I note in Hegel's Energy, a book I published last year, a historical schema suggests itself whereby having first surfaced as actuality in Aristotle's Energeia and having been then negated into a dynamic form of energy in modernity, the concept of energy is only beginning to come into its own in Hegel's thought that replaced both of these movements at once. And so in our 21st century, when the world is on the verge of being destroyed by this highly destructive version of energy, destructive, extractive version of energy, the meaning of energy comes into its own in its completeness as an actuality and a potentiality, as a positive charge, and that charge negated as well, right? More importantly, though, the meaning of energy, must come into its own in our 21st century if the murderous and suicidal tendencies of contemporary energy production are to be countered. Because like all dialectical concepts, it is not just an ideal theoretical entity, a thing of the mind, to put it simply, but also a set of practices, embodied relations and institutions. So the mines, the lithium itself that is extracted, these are not artifacts that are separate from the concept of energy. These are the materializations of a particular conceptualization of energy. And this is what Hegel has taught us. Everything we see around ourselves, the world with its institutions, the social and political world, the natural world with its plants and animals, and even geological systems, all of that is a materialization of ideas, just as ideas are then translated into these material realities, right? Dialectics explores energy within the conceptual electrical current in which the rate of flow of charge depends on tensions between actuality and potentiality vying for the determining role. And it fashions itself into this conceptual electric current, a conduit for the flow of speculative meanings of X and not X, actuality and not actuality, right? So energy has to be understood between these two poles of actuality and not actuality, or possibility, X and not X. And the whole tension between these opposite senses of energy is what is coming through in our 21st century. Aristotle's circuitous definition of energeia as the presence of the thing, not in the sense which we mean by potentially, is elucidated otherwise, once non-actuality appears in its essentially dialectical co-belonging with actuality. But in addition to dialectics, there are other methods for unblocking and gauging the rate of flow of energy's conceptual charge. Some of these other methods have been hovering on the margins of philosophy and theology in the 20th and 21st centuries. In Giorgio Agamben's Inopérosité, the French désouvrement, or in English, inoperativity, it is easy to detect the negation of opera, of oeuvre, work, or ergon, right? So all of these terms are negating this productivist sense with which work has been saddled. And it's not by any means clear that ergon, what Aristotle means work, necessarily entails productivism, right? So that's why I'm saying we have to work at the sense of work, at the meaning of work, right? To decouple it from productivism, precisely, right? Rather than the mere absence of work or activity, it, inopérosité, is, and I'm citing Agamben, a generic mode of potentiality, which is not exhausted, like the individual or collective action intended as the sum of individual actions, in a transitus de potentia ad actum, in the transition from potentiality to actuality. Agamben explicitly aligns the negative charge of inopérosité with a generic potentiality. But leaping over potential actualities and actual potentialities, he makes a full circle and reaches the absolute potentiality and the state of fullness and accomplishment characteristic of Aristotle's energeia. So what is really strange and funny is that in Agamben's pure potentiality, pure inopérosité, we find a reflection of a pure actuality in Aristotle, of what Aristotle means by energeia. Precisely this ergon, this work, decoupled from the sense of productivism that it has received under capitalism. As purely potential beings devoid of a work, ergon, proper to them, humans are not thereby separate from energeia. On the contrary, we, are entrusted with care for energeia as such and as a whole, a mission in which we have suffered a spectacular world historical failure thus far. Right? In his unintended return to an aspect of Aristotelian energeia under the sign of its other, Agamben follows in the footsteps of Georges Bataille, from whom he inherits désouvrement, and Alexander Kojève, with his Sabbath of man, the seventh day, the day of rest, which is the fulfillment of humanity when the work stops precisely. And this is when the fullness of energeia is felt, right? The fullness of a work that is not productivism, of what we would call creativity maybe also. And it is not only a generic potentiality, but also an impotentiality, as Agamben puts it, adynamia, that completes the circle or the circuit of energy, unblocking the conceptual electric current it carries. If for Aristotle, energy is the presence of the thing not in the sense by which we mean potentiality, then the negation of dynamis by energeia dovetails with the not only privative self-negation of potentiality. Right? Emmanuel Levinas's, Jacques Derrida's, Gianni Vatimo's, and John Caputo's philosophical and theological musings on God without God, God beyond God, the weakness of God, or a trace of God, belong together with the non-dialectical conceptual circuitry into which Agamben wires energy, actuality, and potentiality, right? And so finally, before we open up to questions and comments from you, the question, what can philosophy do? What can it contribute to the thinking and practices of energy today? Whither philosophy and energy? Now that I've offered this all too brief overview of the workings of being at work or being in the work that are energy, it is necessary to ask how philosophy may contribute to the theory and practice of the concept it birthed nearly 2.5 millennia ago. My preliminary response is contained in 5 very brief theses, so this is what I'll end with for today. The first thesis. In the 21st century, a philosophical approach to energy is as indispensable as the one guided by physics, among other theoretical and empirical disciplines and methodologies. It is crucial to ask what energy is, not only what the sources of energy might be, but what energy is, how it fits within the logic of means and ends, and in what ways our conceptions of it might be transformed in tandem with changes made to the practices of procuring it. It is not just the practice of procuring energy, but our conceptions that should mutually feed into one another so that they change in tandem, our conceptions of what is energy and how to procure it. Absent this philosophical base, the discourses on alternative or green sources of energy will ring hollow. This is the first thesis. The second, very brief thesis. Despite a series of discontinuities, gaps, and even U-turns in the thinking of energy since Aristotle, its history is intimately bound to the first emergence of energeia on the philosophical scene and to the multiple effects it has produced, some of them unconscious, unintended, or altogether unaccounted for. Provided that a future philosophy of energy keeps in view the grand historical panorama of the concept outlined in this talk very briefly, it would have made a decision leaning toward Aristotelian actuality, the potentiality that succeeded it, or the complex interaction between these two, creating the electrical current running from one to the other. Once this choice takes the form of a decision, it becomes clear that given A, the impossibility of recovering an original concept as though all subsequent intellectual history did not take place, and given B, the tacit involvement of energy as potentiality in our extractive-destructive worldview and mode of energy production, only the third option opens up a bona fide field for the future thinking of energy in philosophy. So we cannot simply revive Aristotle and forget the rest of the conceptual history that followed. We cannot keep clinging to energy as pure potentiality. Rather, we should really stick to this electrical current, conceptual electrical current that opens up between the two senses of the term. Third thesis. Just as the philosophical, theological, and scientific formulations and formalizations of energy are intricately interwoven, so the most mundane practices of procuring energy are inseparable from what at first glance appears to be high theory. In general, the activities and artifacts comprising our world are energy at work and in the work. In particular, activities such as fracking and artifacts such as energy drinks are energy redoubled, reflected into itself, and expressive of our theoretical practical relation to it as something to be extracted, even and especially at the price of destroying that in which or those in whom it is temporarily stored, right? And this is the sad logic of extractivism, that to extract energy as potentiality, you have to destroy the actual carriers, the actual embodiments of that potentiality. Fourth, there's nothing as lethal as hypostatized potentiality, energy in its otherness to itself, separated from the field which has contained it hitherto. And even in one of the slides that Marina showed in her presentation, the Icelandic sort of version of cooling system, a natural cooling system for high power, high energy systems, was emphasizing that unlimited potential unleashed once we work with the earth. But as soon as we talk about unlimited potential, there is necessarily a kind of lethal, destructive force that is built into it. And it sounds counterintuitive because on the left there is a tradition of emphasizing possibility and potentiality that we also find in existentialism. So another world is possible. It is possibility that is always hankered after, right? And of course we should ask, is that possibility something to be extracted from somewhere else? Or should we look for another world in the actual, in what already is, in what has been perhaps gradually taking shape and happening without us realizing it, right? So this is another issue. Similar to a black hole, this pure potentiality emits no light and sucks in everything in its vicinity into itself. When possibility knows no limits, when it disregards the actual with its finite span and fragile outlines, it acts to level down what is for the sake of what could be, to make the actual conform to its own mold, to the mold of an ideal, right? A future philosophy of energy would need to put actuality and potentiality in touch otherwise, either dialectically or non-dialectically. Far from accomplished, the work of unblocking the electric current of energy as a concept has hardly begun. This work, too, is an integral part of the enworkment that energeia is, and that here, more than elsewhere, is urged to keep working on itself. And finally, the final and fifth thesis on the relation between philosophy and energy. By reimagining the shapes that energy may assume today and into the future, philosophy would be reinventing itself, while philosophers would be responding anew to the ancient injunction, know thyself. Know thyself as energy, right? It is not only a matter of envisioning greener, more sustainable forms of energy production, but also, and above all, of creating the ground upon which these axiological judgments are made within the logic of means and ends, informed by evolving energy configurations. If we are working within the logic of pure means, where the only end that counts is profit and capital, then we're doomed to an old extractive, destructive way of energy production, regardless of all the green, so-called green alternatives that are presented before us. Taken in its deepest sense, the conjunction philosophy and energy entails the work of thinking the latter through the former, as much as the former through the latter, to rethink energy philosophically, but also to rethink philosophy energetically, through energy, through another sense of energy. The miniature conceptual electric circuit I have sketched here in our gathering is but a detail in the still hidden vistas of this endeavor. Thank you so much for your attention.
Yeah, thank you. Thank you so much for, I don't know if it works. Okay. Thank you so much for the amazing lecture. I really enjoyed it. And yeah, I think I have many questions, but maybe one will be, given that many of here in the audience are from the creative industries, where it's architecture or design, and also many artists as well. You refer a little bit to it, but most of the times these creative industries are about potentiality. So you hinted to it, like how to conceptualize this creative work that is not based on potentiality, and how it's not based on projecting a future that is to be. So how could you understand creativity within the Aristotelian understanding of energy?
Yes, that's a great question. Of course, here my phenomenological background comes in to the picture, and arguably phenomenology also learns a lot from Aristotle. This was Heidegger's take on it, that Husserl's phenomenology is a kind of an elaboration of Aristotelian thinking. But in very practical terms, phenomenology pays extreme and careful attention to the finite in its finitude, to the actual in its actuality. It does not move to the deep hidden meanings of things, but rather works with the surfaces of things and finds this plenitude of meaning and sense right on the surface, right? And this is a way of thinking and relating to the world that is not extractivist, because again, if we're looking for hidden deep meanings, then we're replicating extractivism in our thinking. We're extracting these deep insights from things while discarding the surface as what is most obvious and what therefore should be just treated as intellectual garbage, while our minds move to the core, right, and enucleate it and take out this potential, this value of what is to be known. In very practical terms, it means thinking with and on the surface. And for me, my ongoing engagement and philosophical and practical interest in plants also belongs to the same constellation of meanings, Aristotelian energy, phenomenology, and plant being or plant thinking, because plants are all about surfaces, about opening up more and more surfaces to the other, and in fact, receiving solar energy on the surfaces of their leaves, right? So with solar energy, with solar batteries, we're trying to replicate this, but in very crude ways, by crude means, precisely using materials like lithium, which still entails a lot of extractivism. And what interests me is a kind of learning from plants, another mode of being on the surface, living on the surface, receiving energy on the surface. And the part of it is a kind of almost mimicry or biomimicry that you find now even in physics, in certain applied physics, where attempts are made to learn from plants how it is that they photosynthesize and precisely solve this big problem of storage, of storing this energy in some sort of a battery. Yeah. Yeah.
Thank you.
Sure.
Hello, thank you. Yes, is the possibility of to store energy related to the possibility of an abstraction, like the abstraction itself is like would be like in a form of alienation, in the sense that you deny to what has been subject of this distraction the possibility of being, like what happens to the work in this process of alienation, like in the sense that a mountain, a human being, a non-human being, when something is extracted for it, it is a form of alienation, and and it's only useful when this extraction can be abstract, like an energy that can be used to something else, like like a form of capital, something like that. So I don't know if I'm clear, but this is the point.
Yes, definitely, and that touches on really what Marx meant by capital. So when Marx talks about capital as alienated labor, alienated work, capital is precisely energy that is alienated. Alienated labor, work. Again, we're returning to the same old ergon of energeia, right? So when we're talking about capital, it is not just the big multinational corporations that are its facades or representatives, but it's precisely a sum total, a growing, ever-growing sum total of alienated energy, which is expropriated from human workers, from other than human labor as well, that is expropriated from the earth in the form of minerals or fossils, right? All of that, so capital is the sum total of this energy that has been alienated and extracted in the abstract and therefore transformed into the abstract form, because and precisely an abstraction is what enables the unlimited nature of possibility or potentiality, right? Because even when it attains a new body and is concretized and it becomes actual in a commodity, this is not the end result, because then the circle commences and continues, and this commodity has to dissolve again into the abstract form of value, according to Marx, right? So abstraction and extraction belong together. You're absolutely right. And they sustain and are sustained at the same time by pure potentiality, a pure possibility that is completely allergic to the actual. And that is why, I mean, all of these worries about the end of the world are precisely due to the complete indifference of capital, understood in this way, to the actual, through which it simply passes as a way station on the way to nowhere, on the way to the ever-increasing sum total of this abstract energy accumulated. Yeah.
I have a question, which is not a question, I'm still thinking in response to your talk, which led me, especially the beginning when you were talking about Aristotle's definition of energy, it led me to think or to reconceive energy as relational, more than something embodied, more than something contained, something that is transmitted, no? And that we learned, probably through the consolidation of the process of modernity, we learned that is a process that is basically relying on this binomial condition between what we give and what we take. And therefore I was wondering, well, and throughout this process of consolidation, we also disconnected ourselves from what we called nature, no? And therefore exclude ourselves from this cycle of giving and taking, no? We take. And I was wondering, through your research and through your thinking about this, if you've been also thinking of energy in this relational mode, not what is contained, not what is embodied, but what exists in between somehow.
Yes, definitely. Even though the logic of relationality can also be a two-edged sword, because some relations work better than others, extraction is also a relation, but a very destructive relation to the other from whom materials are extracted, or even to oneself. So this extractivism, this burnout and exhaustion is a kind of extractivism internalized, right? Where we keep mining ourselves in all kinds of senses until this condition of burnout. But the problem is that I think when, in the Aristotelian sense of energy as actuality, what bothers us is that it seems to entail a certain stagnation, a lack of movement, right? And precisely movement is what we want, and but movement precisely understood in the sense of dislocation, of moving from one place to another. Even though Aristotle gave us a much more ample, a much richer sense of movement as dislocation, but also as metabolism or transformation, as growth and as decay, right? And so in this sense, the imbalance of the giving and taking that you're referring to, Filipa, is the imbalance in a certain modality of movement, a metabolic modality of movement, whereby planetary metabolism has been disrupted in all kinds of ways. Not only is there much more taken from the Earth than it is actually able to replenish, but also lots of materials are being produced that do not dissolve back into the environment, right? All of these non-biodegradable materials, from plastics and styrofoams to spent nuclear materials as well. And all of those are disruptions, blockages of metabolism, of planetary metabolism, just as we can talk about psychic metabolisms and its disruptions, right? So the continuities of ecological scales from the individual psyche to a society or an industry to the whole planet are these kinds of disorders of metabolism, right? Yeah.
Hi. I would like to propose a sixth theorem in which sustainability and energy can become like a binary predicament, maybe in conflict or opposition to ethical energy. And by ethical energy, I see it as where morals or moral itself is taken as a way of potentiality. So also as a way to see accumulation, renovation, and progression. And that's my proposal.
Yes, if I understood correctly, so the ethical energy would be precisely the energy that nourishes the relation that Philippa mentioned, and that circulates and operates on the surface of things without destroying that surface in order to reach the valuable depths. I absolutely agree with that. But what I have a problem with are certain keywords that have become all too obvious for us, like energy, for instance, but not only. Sustainability and renewability. These are two words that bother me a lot, two concepts, precisely because they have not been thought as concepts. They have become kind of tags that are attached, or labels that are attached to desirable action. So sustainability, if you look at the term itself, it is a kind of presumption that the human species is strong enough to sustain the whole planet, the environment as a whole. But in fact, if you look at, and there is a very kind of idealizing movement of sustainability. But if you look at what I call material sustainability, the world is actually sustained, the livable world is sustained by plants who give us breathable air, who nourish us in all kinds of ways, right? So again, there's a certain inversion here that needs to happen in who sustains whom, right? That's one, and renewability as well. Renewability as a desirable form of energy lumps together all kinds of things, from biodiesels that are, if you think about it, whole crops of plants, corn or sugarcane, that are grown in horrible conditions as monocultures, destroying, usually on newly deforested lands. Then they are burnt, once again, combustion, releasing CO2 into the environment, and then the fuel is distilled from them. And that is supposed to be more desirable and better than fossils, because these are presumably renewable, and even their renewability is questionable because the land on which they are grown is depleted very quickly of the nutrients that are necessary to sustain future growth. So to lump these together, the biodiesels, for instance, with other renewable sources of energy, such as aeolic or even solar, is a kind of misnomer, a kind of category mistake, at least to my mind, right? Because instead of renewability, I would talk about elemental energies, for instance. This would be the term that I would favor. Elemental energies, whereby we learn to live and work with the elements, the solar blaze, the wind, the water and the waves, right? Working with the elements instead of against them. Because there is, this is something I haven't mentioned, that there is a hidden principle of extreme oppositionality that is built into extractivism, right? In order to attain energy, we have to oppose ourselves to the other and to nullify and negate that other, right? But in fact, the task, our task of everyone in this room and of maybe of the whole of humanity is a kind of a different relation to the other, as you were saying, an ethical relation to the other, whereby we learn to work with the other and to think of energy not as an oppositional force, but as a synergy, as a working with. Synergy literally means working with, right? And this would be an ethical and ontological at the same time transformation within the meaning of energy, right? Sorry for a long response, but I agree with you.
I think we have to wrap up. Thank you so much.
Thank you.
So we're going to start now. Our last session of the day. Hoping you've been enjoying until now. And it's a session that will already start bridging the two key areas of this whole course. And after this important contextualization and framing of, let's say, the travels of the term energy throughout times, made by Michael Marder, Marina will now present her thoughts on exhaustion and on the relationships between production, between desires and drives to production, and for related to also to performativity and associated with ideas of accumulation and growth, and the state of exhaustion that also connects brains, bodies, minds across humans and non-humans in the accelerated context we've been living in and that we're driving ourselves to. So thank you so much, Marina. Thank you so much. And there will be some time, as before, for questions, discussions, debate after the session.
Yeah, I don't know how to change because it's not connecting. Yeah. Okay. Thank you. Well, thank you. Again, I think some of the questions we discussed before will come again. So, well, let's insist on some of the notions and the cases. It's quite difficult to present after Michael Marder, but yeah, let's try in a more basic way to say some things. So, states of exhaustion. This interest that I have in work and exhaustion came in a way from a personal experience, but not only. So, I had an illness in 2015 that gave me chronic fatigue. But at the same time, I could not take the time that I needed to heal because I needed to work. I was just recently arrived to a new job. So this understanding of, on the one hand, fatigue and a chronic fatigue, and at the same time the need to perform, made me think a lot about these questions. In addition to living in the Netherlands, there is a society where labor, the questions of labor, is what dignifies, in a way, its society. So some of the questions obviously come from this personal interest, but at the same time, this personal interest is extrapolated to a more societal questions that I think we can relate to. And I started to be interested in the relations between work and leisure. And I started with this example. It's a pity because you cannot see, maybe I don't know if it could be a little bit smaller, the slides, because you cannot see the captions. But anyway, this is New Babylon North. So New Babylon is a work by the artist Constant Nieuwenhuis. And he was working on this project from 1956 to 1974. So quite a long time. For quite a long time, he developed this work, and the work evolved as his life did and historical events did. And what he tried to do in this work is to imagine a society that is not organized around work, is not organized around labor, but around play. So in New Babylon, no one works, everyone plays. And how is that possible? Because there is a series of, and he doesn't refer to that much, but he does, automated bodies that live under New Babylon. New Babylon is a structure that is overarching structure that extends through the world and is almost not touching the ground. And below that, there is an army of automated machines that perform the labor that humans don't have to perform anymore. He talks about the Homo ludens, obviously, that in connection to Huizinga and other like the situation is, he was thinking about this other way of organizing society. And what I like about it is that, in a way, it merged many of our, let's say, continue with the topic dreams, but also nightmares about how this all could go. And for him, this idea of the Homo ludens and the society organized around play, it was also the connection to the idea of being creative. So a truly creative life is one that is not productive. So going back to this entanglement between, living and working and the idea of working and being productive, this is a fully creative life where almost, as Mark Wigley puts it, are architects because they are redefining the space continuously. So New Babylon was a place that was continuously being redone. And part of this creative work that was not labor was a form of creativity. So everyone will organize their environments according to their desires. Now, that was the idea. Now, we had this world on the one hand, that is the world of the Homo ludens. And then we have this other world that is almost the world of the machines that sometimes appears with this kind of circuits, smoke, and some sort of reactions. And at a certain point, they become separated. But as the work of Constant evolves, so this is 1968, but when we go to a bit later, 1971, for instance, this erotic space, we start to see that these two worlds start to merge. So we see that what it was a space for play and creativity and freedom in a way, and the realm of machines was separated from that of the humans. Suddenly something collide, and we see violence emerging in what otherwise will be a truly creative and playful society. And scenes of violence start to populate New Babylon. And in this moment, Constant, that for a long time was working with models, 3D models, almost like architectural models, goes back to painting to portray these scenes of violence. And what we see is a body that I wouldn't dare to define what type of body it is, but what I can say is wired. So we cannot know if it's human or not human, but it's definitely connected to a source of power, or it's electricity or something. And this continues. I'm just showing one or two, but there were like plenty of paintings of Constant depicting scenes of violence. This is Les Massacres, it's 1972. And we have this one, La Revolte, 1972. So what he somehow realized along the way of working and inhabiting mentally this New Babylon, because became his life project. So it was not only designing from outside, he started to mentally inhabit that space. And you have to understand also the Vietnam War was, like the protests of 1968, etc., were happening. So realize that what the society that he was imagining that's playful, that was not organized around labor, that was around like play, was nevertheless a violent society. So why I was interested in Constant? Because, well, he had a strong connection with the Netherlands. And in the Netherlands, there has been an attempt as well to imagine a society that is supported by automation. So in the last years, in many spaces of the country, as I said, a Calvinist country where labor work is at the center of, the positions of the humans and the people in society, it's exacerbated also in the way in which society, but also the landscape is organized. Automation was taking a lot of hold. So this is the Port of Rotterdam, and it's one of the terminals of the Port of Rotterdam that is completely automated. And we were looking into that. We could not access it, so we started together with a team at the New Institute, with Victor Muñoz, with Martin Kaupers, and many others. We were documenting what transformations were happening, not only in the built environment and the spaces that were organized, but also in the relations between the people and their, these machines. And what transformations in the labor environment. So what was happening in the port didn't have effects only in the port itself and in the terminal, was having an effect in the entire city of Rotterdam and the neighborhoods, because the transformation of labor and understanding of this, for instance, the crane operator into an office worker, because the cranes were operated by machines, that has enormous implications for the sociopolitical and economic environment and fabric of the city. That was coming from a bit more working city to a service-oriented city. That's the transformation that is in play. So the workers were no longer driving the cranes or the trucks. Those were automated, and the workers were mainly in the offices controlling the operations from their screens. So this automation and this transformation of the ideas of work and labor and the positions of humans and machines in both had entire implications for the built environment. And as an architect, for me, it was interesting to understand those transformations, but also to understand the different understandings of labor that were at play. And as happened with New Babylon, there were also protests. So these transformations in the ways in which people were working and their role as workers were also triggering profound societal transformations and protests. So it was the first time in many, many years that the port of Rotterdam experienced a strike. So it has a level of strikes that happened that the workers were protesting because they were losing their jobs. When we did the research, we realized that it was not necessarily that there were less jobs, but the jobs were different. So there were other jobs, other people being employed in the port, but were not necessarily the same as before. So it was kind of a displacement of certain workers. Because it was just one of the case studies, we got a grant to do the research in Shenzhen in China, and we look into other factories of automated labor. This is ash cloud. So here robots are not replacing humans. Actually, what they are automated are the humans, because there is a software that monitors their performance 24/7 continuously, and they give the indications when they are delayed in comparison to the goals that are set for them. And when that happens, they have different signs that warn them that they are doing a good performance or going behind the performance that is expected. So here is not a machine doing the work necessarily as a physical machine, but it's an algorithm that is controlling. So the middle manager disappears, and instead this software takes over the management of the factory, and the worker continues. This project, the research in Shenzhen was done together with Vezier. This was another idea, so we mapped these relations in these architectural drawings, trying to understand what type of changes were happening in the space of the factory that were different. No? So we have studied the factories almost like in the 19th century factory when Ford also introduced the transformation in the lines of production. So what are the transformations that happen when automation is introduced? In Rapo, this other factory, humans and machines collaborate. They do different tasks. The humans do the tasks that require a much more nuanced and skillful movements with the hands, and also tasks that might be changing faster. And the machines tasks that are more predictable, that require more force, and they don't need replacement very easily, because otherwise they will need to adapt the machines to new tasks all the time. So I think the work of the human is more dynamic, and the work of the machines in this case is more repetitive and stable in a longer period of time to avoid obsolescence of the machines. And this, again, we try to map all these different relations between humans and machines. And finally, this was this other, that is where we will look at the before, Build Your Dreams factory, in which the realm of the machines and the realm of the humans is completely separated. The transformations in automation obviously demand a lot of volume of data. So all these transformations that require softwares, algorithms, machines performing work are also dependent on large quantities of data that have to be processed and stored. So very early in our project, we started to understand that in order to understand these transformations, obviously we didn't have to look only at the factories, not only at the surroundings where these transformations then were having an effect, but also at other infrastructures such as the data centers that were providing necessary infrastructure for these places to happen. And similarly, there were a lot of other infrastructures, in this case in the Netherlands, that were part of the same logic and transformations in ideas of work. So this is the Westland where many greenhouses that provide food for many countries. So the Netherlands is one of the biggest producers of food in the world. And given that it's one of the smallest countries, it's quite remarkable. And this is achieved in these spaces that work 24/7. And what we can see here is the transformation from, a form of production that was primarily family-based, with a farm, etc., and how it transitions toward this other, what I call Cartesian enclosures, these places that are enclosed, that are independent from the conditions that happen in the weather, like the day and night, etc., and they are allowing for a continuous performance, efficiency, and productivity. So these enclosures allow for the maximizing the efficiency of the soil of the Netherlands to make it productive and to be competitive in a larger scale. And this is, you can see the scale. What it was a family-based business, now it's a corporation, because in order to, obviously they are based also in automation, many of them. In order to have this scale of operations, the businesses also scale up. And inside we find these amazing, sublime landscapes. That the same that happens with the lithium pools, we cannot escape the beauty they have. And at the same time, that aesthetic, pleasure, in a way obscures also the activities that are happening, or that are like the chains to which they belong. So fruits and vegetables and flowers are growing. That's in any way during the year, and regardless of the conditions that are outside these spaces, these enclosed spaces. This is, for instance, one of the orchids factories. And mostly it's automated. But humans, again, are not completely disappeared. They have been also displaced. So in this case, a lot of workers coming from East Europe are now working in those factories, and obviously are low-wage workers. So there is also a combination between machine, low-wage workers that are performing this idea of efficiency and continuous productivity that makes the most out of these spaces and the soil. And it's the same in the dairy farms. Now, many of them, the cows are not attended by farmers, by robots that take care of the operations. And what it could be otherwise, seemingly, beautiful coexistence between machines and living organisms, something that reminds us this poem about this cybernetic forest or cybernetic ecology, a meadow where mammals and computers live together in mutually programming harmony, like pure water touching clear sky. Well, it's not quite like that. I hope it will be like that. But the fact is that these animals are being monitored continuously. So in the moment that they display certain patterns or temperature or signals of illness, they will be probably spared easily. So there is also a form of relation and empathy that is broken and is mediated by the machine and the softwares and algorithms, and is making a qualitative assessment of the animals in a pure rationality of capitalism, in a way. These are like the different ways in which now we see the cow. This is how we see the cow from the point of view of the farmer. So what I say is the structural conditions that are implemented in these contemporary spaces of automated labor are not an exception, but another historical episode on how violence is unleashed upon certain bodies in supporting of growing production of capital accumulation. Well, this is something that has been part of the work we have done, and I started to be interested in Cartesianism. On the one hand, because the Netherlands is a very Cartesian space, but I can trace that in many ways to different aspects. On the one hand, and I'm a bit worried to talk about philosophy in certain ways, having Michael, but let's see. Coming from this theory of the animal machine in the cart, was coming from this idea of identifying certain movements, animal movements, and equating to automatic mechanical movements. So early machines, many of them were run and propelled by animals or humans. So Cartesians attempt to explain the physical and biological phenomena by technical models. And by equating them to machines, Descartes refused to attribute soul, reason to animals. And doing so, he rendered the human as a unique being separated from the rest of nature and occupying a superior position about it. So I can see in many ways like the logics that driven this idea of like superiority of the abstraction and reason, of the human reason upon nature in different ways, also in the histories of the Netherlands. For instance, this is an amazing image of this tobacco field that is this topography in Indonesia, to which it is imposed a Cartesian grid to create maximum efficiency and control over it, to a landscape that doesn't work on these logics. Similarly, we can see this view of the plantation in Suriname, and it is interesting because this is just a view that was presented to the investors in the Netherlands to invest on the plantation. And you can see also these grids, extending to the horizon and showing also this way, obviously based on forced labor, the labor of the other, because it was not rendered as human in the case of the enslaved bodies. How this efficiency of the bodies and extraction of the bodies and the soil in order to create an economy that then will serve to generate the capital accumulation in the continent. Similarly, I was talking about these enclosures, like the warehouses that we have seen in the Netherlands, and they have also this historical relation with these factories, the prospect of European factories in Sabi, in the Royal Palace of Sabi, that were Portuguese, English, and French, and Dutch factories. Again, where these enclosures of bodies and land and resources were put into the maximization of profit and accumulation. And even this, these books, like the charts, where gains and profits and activities are traced into this grid that are part of the workings and management of the plantation. So working, for instance, with the idea of race, obviously, is part of it, and I claim that in a way has to also connect it to the Cartesian understanding of differentiation of identities and bodies. So our Membre says to produce blackness is to produce a body of extraction and exploitative objects from which to obtain maximum profit. So in this case, not rendering these humans that had been enslaved as humans also allow them for the exploitation and destruction, as they are part of the other natural spectrum of beings that are also under these forms of exploitation in the plantation. Which is something that continues, as many other researchers, as Joy Bolalvini, who has been working on how the softwares and the algorithms still also not render the black body as a human body, but almost many times as an animal. And in order to conduct certain experiments with the algorithmic project, like thinking, she had to wear a white mask to be recognized by the algorithm. And if I go, we can always imagine also how this othering of certain bodies have played in order for being exploited and having certain conditions under which the labor of someone is performed by the other, no? The form of labors are performed. So in this case, is the electrotechnovision, is what's called the first fully automated kitchen in the world by Hasso Gehrman. And what is interesting was technology was not here, didn't come here to liberate women from their apparent domestic labor and their apparent, like, what was understood their role as wives and workers in the domestic space. But actually was facilitating that labor. So it's not that the kitchen will perform a job that then no one else in the household will have to do, but actually this automated kitchen was perpetuating the notion of the wife as the one who does the domestic labor. So many times we think about technology as a form of liberation. For instance, as we go back to Constant, this idea that we can achieve a society organized around play and around creativity, and the labor is performed by other, that in his case was automated machines, that as we saw, it's not really clear what type of machines or bodies those were. And what I'm trying to kind of create, like a genealogy that I take it very like curatorially, no, historically in a way, but trying to make the argument that how certain bodies have been put in that position almost as machines to perform the work in order to allow us to not to others to not to perform it. And it's based on these ideas of categorization, quantification, and extractions that I'm interested in, and in which, you know, creative activities such as art and architecture and design as part of, if we think about the perspective, how to, in a way, use again the grid and to categorize, objectify certain bodies and transform them in data. Something that with the Cartesian grid, we also do. The Cartesian grid is what allows to position one body, one object, one in a space according to these three axes. And by doing that, we can locate it, but also we can replicate it, and we can categorize it. We can optimize it, we can standardize it, we can control it. And the Cartesian grid is at the core, for instance, of disciplines like the architecture. And it's at the core of what I call the Cartesian enclosure, this idea of the world as organized according to this axis, and this idea that things can be optimized, replicated, and standardized. And we don't have time to go into details, but Simone Nikhil, the designer, has done an amazing research on forms in which, you know, the body has been performed and identified, categorized as data in many ways. So these are like early studies that were done at the University of Utah, trying to create a three-dimensional rendering of the human body. Now we are very used to that. We have like scanners, but these were the first attempts to do such a thing. And more recently, for instance, in Siemens, companies like Siemens, they also render particular bodies, like this is Jill, and they have Jill, and they have Jack. And these avatars are used to try products and spaces, for instance, of the factories. So they create a standard body, the average man or the average woman, according to databases that who knows where they get. And they create Jill and Jack. And according to these avatars, they introduce them in computer-generated models to actually test that they are ergonomically sound. But by doing that, they are also rendering certain bodies, like the standard ones, and the others, they are othered. Recently, they realized that they were doing this, and for other markets, they were creating different avatars suitable for markets that were maybe the sizes. For instance, if I will be, I live in the Netherlands, and I'm very below like the average size of Dutch woman. So you depending on the geography, you clearly have different sizes. So Siemens now have different catalogs of bodies, which is problematic, right? And this is an installation that Simone Nikhil did, reflecting of forms of mining of the body and representation through this idea of the perspective, the forms of representation, three-dimensional representations of body, and what happens when we go from 2D, 3D, and 2D continuously in these transfers of data what actually happens and how they affect the understanding of space and bodies at the same time. So building on that, I also worked together with Angela Ruia, Francis van Westernen, and this is a work by Danilo Correale in the Triennale, thinking about exhaustion, workers that they don't sleep. So for instance, they aren't asleep. Forms of regenerative design that maybe think, for instance, Lucy McRae about how a bed that helps you release oxytocin, hormone responsible of building trust and bonding. So how actually design could be part of this restorative idea of the world, which could be very problematic. But in any case, we are entangled, that we are embedded in this kind of self-optimization of the body, where it is by augmented prostheses like this bed or other formulas that we are always thought that we are organisms, bodies that could be always get more efficient in the labor we have to perform. And obviously that leads to quite a collective precarity and exhaustion that people like Byung-Chul Han has identified as the burnout society. This idea that the neoliberal subject trying to self-optimize itself tends to self-exploitation. So trying to become better, we are destroying ourselves. And he identifies burnout and depression as the maladies of our time. So it's not only the external factors, but our own understanding of our role in the world, also as workers and as a machine that has to be continuously being improved, self-improved, lead us also to a collective form of exhaustion. And I was showing this before. These are from this group, United Voices of the World, section of the architectural workers that started in London during the pandemic, claiming that they are exhausted. We are tired. And especially during the pandemic, there were more and more workers that felt exhaustion. And that was socialized, something that perhaps in many cases had been a feeling that was individualized. Suddenly it became collective. And that has certain potential. No? So we saw something that was announced as the Great Resignation, that someone identified like that. Many workers quit their jobs during the pandemic. And economists were trying to understand if there were the subsidies by the government or there was just like a kind of silent strike, collective strike, that workers were saying, we are not going to continue like that. But recently I've been reading that actually the rates of employment are rising again. So they identified that maybe it was a moment in which people identified they wanted to change jobs, and they were in the middle of doing that. But in that case, I think it's an interesting notion, the Great Resignation, and this idea of quitting, and what it means to not to identify yourself with, your subjectivity as a worker. What happened with all these people that resign? What were their daily activities? How do you conceptualize that? This is where we saw it before. So we are always depending on more. So this idea of self-optimization of us as workers, as creative thinkers, as human beings, as partners, as friends, as our filters, our appearances, also have an effect or have a translation into our search of energy. And yeah, this kind of idea of lack of. So this idea of self-optimization is obviously connected to what Michael was saying, this idea of a lack of something that we have to continue working on to achieve. So an ideal standard of us and the world and that is always a projection to someone else. And this is where lithium comes, because it's the formula that tells us that everything will be fine. It's the formula that on the one hand says, we are going to solve the issues with energy because we have green or renewable energy that makes the transition possible towards from fossil fuels to other type of energy, electric vehicles, etc. And at the same time, it comes to cure our fatigue. both with mineralized waters, with spas, but also our mental health issues with the intake of lithium as well. And it's not a contemporary phenomenon, as we have seen. It's also something that, well, has its origins in, we have seen the Roman baths that we are going to visit. So this idea of like being in connection to the mineral waters is something that comes from antiquity, but at the same time, it was commercialized very much during the 19th century as well, with these pedras salgadas and all this network of thermal baths, balnearios in the region of Porto and many other places in the world. And it's like the source of health that is also bringing us, that is what we are lacking. We are bringing us this desire of, you know, the energy, the health, the life that we are in constant need of. So from one type of swimming pool to the other, so this is the counterpart. On the one hand, what we are looking for in our own bodies, to this kind of restorative element that will give us back the energy that we are supposed to be lacking, to the lithium extraction that is also come as a, you know, ideal element that will come to solve our problems with energy. So now that the fossil fuels are, you know, running low or that they're like damaging too much the planet, don't worry, we can continue having our dreams of progress through these elements. We can have our projected futures imagined by people like Elon Musk of self-driven cars in Tesla and many other worlds that are coming with those dreams, these dreams of progress. The idea of the supernatural power that is always waiting for us to be tapped in and to be leveraged to give us to that ideal space that we are looking for. But the reality is that, a bit like going back to what Michael was saying, in a way leading to a particular idea that is extractive and destructive at the same time. So it's going to a direction that is continuously projected on something else, but what we encounter is a lot of destruction. And then we are moved by these images when they say, do I drink lithium? Do I eat copper? So how this actually builds up in an ontology, in the actuality of the right now, how these different futures are articulated with the necessities that are the ones that we have now and the needs of our bodies right now, the body of the human and non-human and the planet. And there are many different organizations that are protesting this projection and these ideas of futures that are sold by these companies and even governments, and they are not thinking about the impact they have on the actual spaces of environmental communities around the world. And as we say, yeah, there are attempts to court them, like to hold them. When someone says this is actually this idea of the future is putting at risk the activities, the coexistence that is happening right now in these towns, where someone identifies that a huge data center will take the energy that an entire town will need. But there are very little instances, because most of the times we are still obsessed with this compulsive desire that is represented here on both the lithium battery and the lithium pill, and our desire for more energy. And this is the book that, in a way, we have been working on these questions, in which the work of Godofredo Pereira is a very important part, because he has been working on these questions for a long time, and he will present that in the next days. The work that he has done with the lithium triangle in the RCA research studio. And he was also looking into all these geographies. And alongside the work of, Anastasia, that was the principal investigator of the work on lithium, Godofredo Pereira, who had been working on that for such a long time, we need also comrades, allies, to imagine non-Cartesian worlds, worlds that I think exceed categories of beings that are not putting one at the expense of the other, and others that allow us to generate other understanding of our relations to the world, and maybe other understandings of energy and work, but that has been done by Michael before. So this attempt to think about more than human relations is an attempt to kind of counter the logics of the categorization of beings according to the human and non-human, and differentiation of them that allows the exploitations of the second. I'm particularly intrigued by the work of Patricia McCormack because, well, she proposes the a-human as a category of thinking as well. In a way, what will mean that the human will go extinct? And we can imagine that maybe, well, one can imagine that this is literally, that the human as such becomes extinct, and then there is a new idea of the world, and a world that is not organized around human categories or human epistemologies, but also what it will mean to undo the category of the human as we know now, and think differently about the relations. So if we are no longer identified or conceptualized as humans, what other relations we can organize with the rest of the world? And Marisol de la Cadena, who will be here in a few days, that allows also to think about this excess of categories when she says that this is a mountain, but it's not only such. What does it mean? What does it mean when we conceptualize mountains not just as a repository of materials, minerals that could be extracted? What does it mean when suddenly when we think about a mountain as a living being and as an earth being? What type of other relations we will establish with them when we don't think about matter as a source of energy? And I like very much what Michael was saying about the surface, no? How deep we have to go into the mountain in order to release the energy. So, and all these other layers that are disposable here. What if those layers are actually not disposable? And obviously, you had already the luck, as I did, to listen to the work of Michael Marder. So I think all these voices allow to conceptualize other ways of being in the world, allow to conceptualize other forms of alliances, other categories, other understandings of work, and other understandings of our own bodies also, and subjectivities. But yeah, then we always have back the idea of the dreams. And companies like this one that, as I explained before, won the tender process to exploit the lithium in Chile, is asking us to continue dreaming in the way we have since modernity. Build your dreams. And that means thinking about batteries, solar panels, electrical vehicles, self-driven vehicles, and so on. These are the dreams that we are said that we have to pursue, that they are there. And in front of them, there is certain realities in the ground. The forms of water extractions that are at play in the Atacama Desert because of lithium mine, but not only, because of the water that is needed for certain industrial operations, but not only because the water that is needed to support the workers in the mine, but not only, but the water that is needed for the hotel industry, but not only, and all these potentialities that are both also in industries like the tourism and the mining and etc. And then how they contrast with this place that is next to it. This is also part of the San Pedro de Atacama, but this is Toconao, a place also that Godofredo knows very well. This village that is called the Place of Stones in Atacameño. And yeah, it's impossible not to be amazed by, the richness of the place. In one of the driest deserts, encounter this beautiful place, but also about the way in which they manage the resources, they manage the water. And this form of solidarity that is enacted here by the community, and how they think about the existing water and how this could be distributed in the community in a fair way. and how these little architectures of the canals, of the water channels, they serve, like they help to irrigate the lands with the water that exists and the water that comes to the village. And is managed by the different inhabitants by turns, and they always follow, and they don't jump the turn because they know that if they will take more water than the one that they deserve, they will leave someone else without water. And as the lithium mines and the industries of extraction, also including the industries of tourism, are taking more and more water, the irrigation turns in Toconao are also taking more space. So each time that the water is used by others, the turns, they have to be spaced in time as much. Thank you.
Hello, thank you for such an interesting presentation. I was very much listening and thinking about actually everything. This exhaustion, it's so much about the body, and then I was thinking about if actually automatization is kind of going, and you mentioned about this self-optimization, and it is kind of related with this body movement. But we as a human, we have a mind. And if I'm thinking about creativity as energy, then I was thinking, what would be your opinion about potential of the creative energy for the future labors?
Yeah. That's a good question.
Thank you.
But you identify the creative energy of the mind as?
No, well, I was just wondering, like, I'm very much interested about this future labor, like, because we are afraid as humans, we are a little bit afraid that, you know, digitalization comes in, automatization comes in, and where we as a human kind of place ourselves, but nowadays we are so much talking about and thinking about, and maybe what you mentioned about this creating perceptions, projections for the future, that the creativity is kind of shall be empowered for the humans to kind of, let's say, reshape the way how we live further on this planet and at the same time sustain it. And it's just, I think I know that it's maybe very kind of not easy answer the question about how creativity could be, what is this potential for the creativity and humans in thinking about the future labor.
Yeah, I mean, I was trying to ask the same question to Michael before, so that means that I don't have the response. So maybe we have to continue thinking about it along the week, because I mean, I'm not gonna paraphrase Michael because I will do a butcher job. So what I can say is that for instance, I was referring to the creative industries. So that's already meaning that creativity has been turned into a productive labor. So it has been mined. We are being mined. Also, the creativity is something like it's extracted, as it's extracted any material. So it's not arts, like in places like the Netherlands, it's called like that, the creative industries. And that has a meaning. So I think that in certain ways, the way in which creativity is positioned in certain forms of productivity, that not necessarily leads to a completely different understanding of the world, or even what Constant was proposing about this creative life that was organized around play. My entire argument is that it has a point. So I don't say, I think I'm still intrigued by that project because I think it has certain beauty about thinking what will be a society not organized around labor. But I think what is problematic to me is that in order to do that, he found that it was necessary to have other bodies performing the labor. And that, for me, that's the entire contention about New Babylon. Because what will have happened if will be only play, and you wouldn't need otherwise to have an army of automated machines doing the labor that these people who is playing is not performing. So what other system? How will be New Babylon if will be all play? And so that is, again, that's the creative industries. So I don't have a response. I don't know if Michael wants to jump in, feel free, or someone wants to add something. But in a way that you formulated, I don't see the outside yet. And I think Michael was talking about a form of, becoming a plant, almost like this, embracing the surface, instead of like going deep into abstraction, going to the deep layers of things to extract meaning, extract materials from it. And for me, that form of extraction is also the automated industry. That's what I'm interested in it, because it's actually going into allowing to do things that otherwise would not be possible, and the same of constant. So but then when I think about it, it's like, so then we are like in the polis in Athens, like, enjoying like the philosophy, and but then in this case, they were also slaves, no? So we need Michael here to stay a few days so we can think about it.
Yeah, I have a question, or more of a thinking, because automation is not new in the discourse, and if you think about Marx's words of automation during the Industrial Revolution, he realized that with the implementation of the machine in labor, you produce more, the labor hours are the same, so you will think that laborers will gain more because they produce more. But this didn't happen, and so what it occurred was that capitalism was able to lower the wages and introduce more people to labor, and child labor, or even sick people working, or whatever. So it's this issue that in capitalism you understand that what is variable in capital is the labor force and not actually the machine itself. So what I'm trying to get to is that we need to put the issue of private property and who owns the means of production in question here. And for example, we've talked about Chile, and it's really interesting because for a brief period of time during the Allende government, they did get some important things going. And for example, the coal miners, they were able to nationalize their mines, and they did not ask if what coal was doing to the world or anything. They understood the importance of their work, and they understood the importance of having the power to decide what their work would be, and not going on the alienation the capital produces on the production you do. So they understood the importance of what they were trying to do. And even water there was privatized after, so it's an issue, not in Portugal at least, although there are already some municipalities who have privatized water. So everything is about what you do in the means and the relations of production you are living in. And so when we put these questions, I understand, are we actually saying that we should not have the right to develop, to grow? Or is this a yes or no question? Or should we try and propose something else, something different, some relations of productions that are not the ones we're living in? And I want to know what you think about this.
So no, what I'm trying to make the point is that I think the relations that are based on forms of exploitation to an other that are replicated in different ways. So for me, and maybe, it could be very controversial, but the fact that we are using a machine or we are using an animal or we are using another human body, I think that's, or a plant, that in a way is perpetuating certain logic about forms of exploitation to whatever other. And according to different developments in history, that other has been conceptualized differently. And then, yeah, that's what I said, that I did it curatorially, because in a short talk, and I'm not also a philosopher, not an historian, I'm more like an architect, but in a way I was trying to identify different bodies that had been taking that position in different moments. So that's what I'm trying to do. So for me, even in the question of labor rights, if there is, again, a form of exploitation, and I'm not proposing that, even that you own the means of production. Even if you own the means of production, if the type of relations that you are creating with others are exploitative, for me that's the issue, because it's something that will perpetuate. And then we'll always find another, whatever that will be. And that's what I'm trying to see. How do we can conceptualize other form of relations that will not entail the exploitation of another? And then we are always displacing the question. It's like, okay, what is the Earth? The Earth, but we go to the planet, where is Mars? So it's always like displacing the question to certain, but then we will find always a territory and another body to mine and to exploit. So how we can break that, I don't have the response there, for sure. And then going back to the automation, obviously, there are these dreams of automation as, this luxury communism, But that doesn't happen because, as you said very well, it's not that, the machine allows to make the wages lower, actually. And what I was saying about the Port of Rotterdam is that, the number of workers they were displaced. So they are forms of displacement that happen both in terms of roles, but also geographies. So, you have migrant workers that go from one location to the other. So the issue of the exploitation is displaced, but it's not that, workers are less exploited than before. It's just like there are reorganization of bodies across geographies and across roles. So, yeah, the automation clearly doesn't provide a future without work. And I hope I'm not quoted saying that in a future where this is the case. But yeah, I take the chances.
Thank you. I think we have time for one last question. Yeah, cool. Thank you so much for that, Marina. That was great. I was really interested in the genealogy that you were sort of tracing from the Ford factory to the new kind of surveilled warehouse, right? Where you have metrics and quotas rather than kind of, the sort of steady beat of the machine that people keep up with. And I was talking about this with someone the other day where we were talking about this same history, and we're trying to think of it in terms of rhythm and tempo, right? Whereas, yeah, the Ford factory had this steady beat that the machine set the rhythm and you kept up with it. And we know it was steady because the guys from Motown Records who all worked at the Ford Motor Company, they would write songs to that beat, right? But then, and the League of Revolutionary Black Workers, right? That's the kind of beat that they organized around. But then when you look at something like the Amazon Fulfillment Center or these new models of warehouses where it's based on quotas and metrics, and you have to do one order every 9 seconds, right, as the baseline. There's no rhythm to organize around there. So if the climate of Amazon or the sort of the rhythms of production or the tempos of production that Amazon demand aren't conducive to this kind of organizing, then my question is just how do you organize against this? Do you think the thing to do is to inhabit this category of exhaustion the way that the United Voices of the World Union did? Or do you think it's to refuse to be exhausted in the first place, like the Amazon Labor Union?
Nice. No, I know, but I think you know the answer because you're working in logistics, right? And you're trying to understand how logistics can operate differently, if any. There is a particular rhythm connected to logistics, and sometimes logistics has this image of efficiency that allows things to think that they works, they works well. So it's kind of this notion of the world that is smooth and operates, but actually logistics is full of like forms of contention and forms of struggles and points of tension and rupture and delays and so on. So I think there is this tension between efficiency and inefficiency, or efficiency and nodes of rupture that in the contemporary logistics is very well ingrained, is very well orchestrated. So, for instance, when now we see that there are delays in supply, sometimes some of them are, very much designed in certain ways. So it's not always that logistics works when it's smooth. It's always also works when the delays are weaponized in certain ways. So how can you counter that logic? I know that I'm not a person I'm not working in rhythms and so on and vibrations, but I know, for instance, people like Delea de Yemo, all his work is conceptualizing the kind of logistics in a different way, or countering the notion of logistics, so forms of rhythm and music, and he's coming to, for instance, Afrobeats, or like using other type of rhythm that is not the rhythm of the machine to understand all the forms of organization and action. And I'm not an expert on that, but I find it intriguing because it's not that easy to say, oh, we just like refuse. Because this idea of also a strike or quitting, I'm obviously intrigued by it, but it's not something that is unnatural to the system where we are. There are many ways in which contemporary logistics is blockages, like with migrants, with the borders, so it's not always into the smooth. It's not always into, sometimes it's making things flow and others to prevent them. So it's not that easy that we just like reject to move or something like that. So yeah, I don't know, maybe again we have to, I don't know what a mover like that will help to conceptualize that. So I don't have an answer, but I think it's an interesting point to think about, and I know where you go, and I find it fascinating to think in those terms.
Thank you, Marina, and thank you, everyone. I think it's a good place to leave us, to a mission, to imagine otherwise. Just a few notes for those of you who are going to spend the evening out. The city is going to be in a festive mood because my father would be proud of me by saying this, but the city club, the Porto, just won the national championship. So there will be parties. There are, at the same time, there are many art events happening tonight, namely one by a dear co-worker and fellow of the City Gallery in a space called Dentro, which is in Rua do Almada 254, if you want to pass by. His name is Hernani Batista, and there are many other art projects in case you want to try to avoid the Dragons, which are the name of the Football Club do Porto supporters, and continue in this mood. Otherwise, we hope to see you tomorrow at 11 here to continue our sessions. And thank you so much. Thank you for the speakers. Thank you for everyone for being with us. And see you tomorrow.